Hey, this is Jason for Soulfire, and today I want to talk about the evangelical purity culture and really ask the question of how did the evangelical purity culture fail an entire generation in the church? So when we're talking about the purity culture, primarily we're talking about the 90s and the early 2000s, and this was a response from the church to the sexual revolution and primarily a response to the emergence of STIs, and the heart of the purity culture was to get young Christians to remain pure. So there were a number of components of the evangelical purity culture. There were purity pledges, primarily a group called True Love Waits. They had a pledge that says the following. It says, believing that true love waits, I make a commitment to God, myself, my family, those I date, and my future mate to be sexually pure until the day I enter marriage. Now, I kind of find a pledge like this a little bit funny when you're saying that you want to be pure until the day you enter marriage. It almost gives you the idea that after you get married, all bets are off for your purity. I'm not sure why they decided to word it that way. But the True Love Waits pledge was taken by hundreds of thousands of young Christians, and they also had things like purity rings. We've got an example of one right here. There were purity dances, which they somehow named purity balls. I have no idea how that got past the PR team, but hey, back in the 90s, they went ahead and went for that. So a number of components there of the evangelical purity culture. And one of the biggest names in purity culture was Joshua Harris. He wrote this book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye, as a 21-year-old. And he was advocating for courting and not dating. And I actually remember reading this book. It was extremely popular, probably because of the title. It had a very catchy title, and he sold a gajillion copies of this book. And he had a lot of rules in there for dating. And one of the more extreme ones was that he advocated no kissing until marriage. And that is a pretty extreme look at how to go ahead and date. And so this kind of became the book that defined the evangelical purity culture. And it was really challenging young Christians to take an extreme version of purity amidst a culture that had a sexual revolution going on. Now, there has since been a lot of pushback from this book. Joshua Harris himself has actually walked back some of the content from this book because it did damage to a lot of the younger generation. I'll talk about some of the specifics of that in a little bit. In fact, you may have even heard Joshua Harris has since left the faith and even left his marriage. So he has taken an extreme departure from some of those things that he was proclaiming, and he was even a pastor for a long period of time. And so the problem of the purity culture was really primarily this: taking the issue of rules and trying to use rules to influence the heart. So it really was rules versus the heart. So I want to talk about three specific areas that the purity culture failed. And the first way is it primarily used guilt, fear, and shame. They wanted to enforce external rules, especially on children. So they used fear, guilt, and shame to try to influence the behavior of children. And so I want to tell you guys about the worst illustration that I've ever heard. Now, Matt Chandler has shared about this illustration. I've heard pastors and youth pastors use this. This was the type of illustration that was used during the height of the evangelical purity movement. So you'd gather a bunch of young people, maybe you have a youth rally, and the pastor would hold up a rose, and he would take a beautiful, perfect rose, and he'd say, look at this beautiful rose. It smells good. It is beautiful. Who wouldn't want a rose like this? And he would say, I want all of you to check out this rose. And he would hand it to the person in the front seat, and then he would have them pass it down throughout the entire group of people that had come. And so everybody would hold it, smell it, and then pass it on. And so he would then go into his fire and brimstone purity lecture about why you should remain pure. And then the rose would come back, and he would say, it'd be damaged by that point, and he would say, this is what you're like if you fail in God's standard of purity. You're like this damaged rose. It once was so beautiful, and now you are broken. Who would want a rose like this? Now I'll share a little bit more about how that illustration ended, as Matt Chandler shared that at the end of this video. But really, you can actually summarize the church's perspective on sex. I kind of call it the anti-Nike campaign. It was essentially just don't do it. We gave our youth a whole bunch of rules, but primarily we tried to instill fear in them. Just don't do it. Rather than having a clear teaching on the beauty of God's design for sexuality, it really was influenced negatively. We were trying to tell them, just don't do it. And we rarely showed God's heart and his design for sexuality, the beauty of sexuality, and it was primarily negative. And it tried to teach us that anybody who strayed from God's design for sexuality, they were dirty, they were damaged goods, who would like them? They're less valuable. And I believe that was primarily true, especially for women. The evangelical purity culture shamed women that if they strayed whatsoever, that they were less valuable, that they were dirty, and that there's going to be significant consequences in their life. And one of the things that the purity culture did is it put pressure on women to control men's lustful behavior. So particularly in the area of dress, the whole modesty culture, women were told that they had to dress a certain way so that they wouldn't be tempting toward the young men in the youth group or the men in the church. Now, is there a little bit of truth to that? Sure. But what you're telling women is you are responsible for the sexual temptation of men who are around you. And that is clearly not true. Now, certainly we can influence one another by the way that we dress, by the way that we use our bodies, but I need to take responsibility for my heart, for my temptations, for my sexual sins. And I can't blame external tempters. I can't blame others. And so women in particular felt a lot of pressure. They felt a lot of shame and guilt about their bodies and about how God had designed their bodies. They were particularly told to think that it was dirty, that it was less valuable, something shameful, something to be hidden. And then the second thing that the evangelical purity culture did was it taught the prosperity gospel of sex. Now, the prosperity gospel of sex would essentially be this. We were taught growing up in this culture, if you obey God's design for sexuality, then God will bless you sexually. You will marry a smoking hot wife or a smoking hot husband. You will have phenomenal sex, and it's going to be just this amazing experience. The problem with that is God has never promised such. God has never promised you, if you obey a certain set of rules, that the outcome will be a tremendous sex life in marriage. And one of the things that we're taught there is that marriage will solve all of our problems. So if you have temptations to sin or pornography or lust, you'll get married, you'll have this amazing sex life, all those temptations will go away. Well, we know that isn't the case. Talk to anyone who's married and you will know that is not the case. Look at how many people that are married, they have affairs or they get stuck in pornography. Marriage does not solve the issue of sexual sin and sexual temptation. In fact, marriage can be one of the most difficult, most painful things somebody goes through. And if your response to pain and difficulty is to run to sexual sin, say pornography, marriage is not going to solve your problem. It could even make it worse. If your relationship in marriage is difficult, you'll run to sexual sin, to pornography. And one of the challenges of this purity gospel of sex is that it had communicated before you're married that sex is dirty, sex is bad, sex is this shameful, gross thing. Well, how can two people just turn that switch off the moment that they get married? So for 20 years, they've been told sex is bad, it's this dirty thing. And yet supposedly on their wedding night, they're supposed to flip a switch and enjoy the beauty of God's design for sexuality. Well, a lot of people growing up in this evangelical purity culture, they took the shame that was associated with sex and it took it right into their marriage. And think about all the things in marriage that can make a sexual relationship difficult. Past sexual abuse, past emotional abuse, the influence of pornography. In 2019, it is highly unlikely that two people are going to get married today and one of them not be influenced by pornography. There can be physical issues that prevent a good sex life. There can be all sorts of things that can make your sex life in marriage difficult. And for those that were brought up in this evangelical purity culture and they followed the rules that they were taught, if you then get married and it doesn't go the way you were promised, you're left to either assume God is a liar or that there's something wrong with you, that you are broken, that there's something wrong with you for why you didn't have this amazing sex life. And finally, the third way that the evangelical culture failed us is that it really was not gospel-centered. What the purity culture did is it tended to divide people into two camps. You had the pure and then you had the impure. So if you followed God's rules, the rules defined by the evangelical purity culture, you were pure. If you strayed at all, you were impure and there was going to be consequences and you're basically going to get God's plan B for your life. Well, in her book, Rethinking Sexuality, Dr. Julie Slattery goes to length to talk about how the purity culture divided people into those two camps, pure and impure. Think of how anti-scriptural this message is. Think of Jesus' interaction with the Pharisee in Luke 18. You see, the Pharisees were the one who divided people into two camps, pure and impure. Well, in Luke 18, Jesus is dining at the house of a Pharisee, and this woman of the city, perhaps a prostitute, comes in and she begins to wash Jesus' feet with her hair and with her tears. And so she's in close proximity to Jesus, and it says of the Pharisee, when the Pharisee who had invited Jesus saw this, he said to himself, if Jesus were a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of woman this is who is touching him, for she is a sinner. And so here the Pharisee is dividing people into two camps. He looks at himself as pure, he looks at this woman as impure. And I can unfortunately relate to the Pharisee. I was a hypocrite growing up in this evangelical purity culture. I thought I'm following these certain rules, God must bless me, and I looked down on others. I treated them with contempt. Back to that parable in Luke chapter 7, where this woman is ministering to Jesus, and the Pharisee says if Jesus knew what kind of woman this was, he wouldn't allow her to touch him. Jesus' response to this Pharisee is he gives one of the shortest parables in the Bible. He says, hey, you had this moneylender who two people owed him money, one 50, one 500. He forgave them both. Who do you think will love him more? And the Pharisee says, well, probably the one who had the greater debt forgiven. And Jesus says, yes, that's correct. And he says, look at this woman. She loves much because much has been forgiven. You see, the evangelical purity culture was not gospel focused. It divided people into two camps, pure and impure, but the reality of the gospel is that there is no pure and impure. We are all debtors to God. We are all impure, especially sexually. We all have sexual sin and sexual struggles in our life. This Pharisee should not have been looking down on this woman. The purity narrative told us we were damaged goods if we struggled with sexual sin, yet the gospel tells us it is our sin and it is our brokenness that points us to our need for Jesus. That is the reason it was the tax collectors and the prostitutes who readily accepted Jesus. They readily accepted the gospel. Well, that brings me back to the worst illustration that I've ever seen with this idea of the rose, and the rose is going back and forth, and the rose is broken, and then the evangelical purity leader, he would say, who wants this dirty and broken rose? And Matt Chandler, as he shared, being a youth in a situation like that, said everything inside of him wanted to stand up on his chair and yell, Jesus wants the rose. And that is how the evangelical purity culture failed. It told us that nobody would want dirty, damaged, and broken goods, yet Jesus does. Jesus came for sinners. He came for the lost and broken, people like me. The gospel is for sinners. So the purity narrative primarily focused on rules, and it did not focus on the heart. It used guilt, fear, and shame to influence behavior, primarily trying to influence children in that manner. It taught the prosperity gospel of sex, which is false. The idea that if I do certain things, God must bless me in certain ways. Now, there is certainly a blessing for following God's laws, but there's no guarantee that if we do A, B, and C, then He must provide an amazing marriage and an amazing sex life. And also, it simply was not gospel-centered. Well, I hope this video has been helpful. This is Jason for Soulfire. Subscribe if you want to see more content like this. Place a comment down below if you agree or disagree or have some thoughts that you want to share, and I'll see you in the next one.